This unit of the course introduces prophetic writings as a type of religious literature and prophets as a type of mediator between God and the Hebrew people. Particular attention is given to the books of Amos and Hosea in the Old Testament, and as with other writings we examine in the course, particular attention is given to the historical background and the literary form of these writings. Mediators between God and Israel. In Genesis, we read how God establishes a special relationship with the Hebrew people. Abraham and the first generation of his descendants have direct encounters with God. In the writings of the Hebrew Bible that follow, we see God relating to the Hebrews through various types of mediators. The Torah, or law, a covenant established with the Hebrews at Sinai, functions as a mediator between God and the people. The Torah establishes a priesthood to conduct sacrifices, so priests emerge as a type of mediator. As we read further in the Hebrew Scriptures, we encounter mediators in the form of kings, prophets, and sages. Prophets as mediators. A prophet is a special type of mediator between God and Israel. A prophet speaks for God. That is the root meaning of the Greek word prophetes, from which we get our word prophet. This Greek word is used to translate the Hebrew nabi, which can mean one who calls or one who is called. Biblical prophets are sometimes referred to as seers. The connection between vision and message varies from prophet to prophet. In some cases, a prophet's vision and message is the result of a direct encounter with God. Other times, prophets just appear and speak for God. But the appearance of a prophet is almost always prompted by a national crisis. The relation of prophets to other mediators. Walter Brueggemann cautions us against imagining prophets living in social vacuums. They knew the communities to whom they spoke. They knew the religious practices and beliefs, what we commonly call traditions, that shaped a community's life. Their messages often contain echoes of particular forms of tradition. Amos seems to be familiar with traditions of what Brueggemann calls international wisdom thought. Hosea and Jeremiah appear to know the covenant tradition of Deuteronomy. Bernard Anderson sees affinities between Hosea and Jeremiah. Although they lived at different times, these two prophets address similar crises in different ways. I encourage you here to pay close attention to the introduction to Amos in the New Interpreter's Bible. The writer of that introduction, John Barton, talks about the questions interpreters have raised about the role of covenant theology in the message of Amos. I also encourage you to read the entry on Deuteronomistic Historian and the discussion of Deuteronomistic framework within that article. That'll give you some insight into the Deuteronomistic tradition and its idea of covenant. Along the same line, I would encourage you to read Study 2 in Anderson's book, The Unfolding Drama of the Bible. Study 3 is assigned because it deals directly with the role of the prophet, but to understand it better, it's well worth your time to read the rather short Study 2 that introduces the idea of covenant. The historical background of Amos and Hosea. The prophets Amos and Hosea were active in the northern kingdom of Israel around the same time. In the mid-8th century BC, Amos traveled to Israel from the southern kingdom of Judah, where he was a shepherd. A little later, Hosea, a native of Israel, spoke to his own people. In the opening verses of both books, we have indications that the prophets were active during the reign of Jeroboam. During this period, Israel was prosperous and militarily strong. That would soon change. In 722, Israel was conquered by the Assyrian Empire. These events probably caused people looking back on the careers of these two prophets to give credence to what they said. That is, their warnings of coming judgment and disaster were proven to be true. But for those who heard their words, they did not know for sure whether these events were going to happen or not. The fact that their teachings survive strongly suggests that it was the power of their words that make these two prophets remembered and make their teachings be recorded and become part of Hebrew Scripture, more than it is the fact that the coming gloom and doom that they saw on the horizon actually occurred. The call of each prophet. Part of understanding the difference between prophets is understanding the circumstances surrounding their call. Amos says of himself, "I am no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I am a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees. And the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, 'Go prophesy to my people Israel.'" Why does Amos say that he is not a prophet? Why might Amos not fit people's conceptions of a prophet? Hosea's call to be a prophet seems to coincide with this command from God: "Go, take for yourself a wife of whoredom, and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." How might Hosea's obedience to this commandment set him apart from other prophets, especially prophets who stress obedience to the covenant? The Hebrew scribes who have set in writing the teachings of the prophets have provided the structure in which we find their teachings. Oftentimes there are several messages or oracles that are attributed to the prophet, and the scribes provide introductions to these sections. Sometimes the points of transition are fairly clear. Sometimes the transitions between oracles are not so clear. Interpreters often rely on common themes to see unity in individual sections of prophecy or oracles. Here you see a common understanding of what the structure of Amos looks like. Opening warnings. Before delivering warnings to Israel, Amos delivers warnings to Israel's neighbors. The first 6 nations or peoples addressed are non-Hebrews. Then Amos addresses his own native land of Judah. What is the significance of a Hebrew prophet delivering warnings to non-Hebrews? Presumably these people have their own gods and prophets. As you think about this question, I encourage you to read the entry on prophets in the HarperCollins Bible Dictionary. The author of this entry, Robert Wilson, talks about the role of prophets in the ancient Near East, that is, how prophets appear in other religions beside the religion of the Hebrews, and what some of the similarities and differences are. Also recall God's blessing of the nations in Genesis 12:3. How might the sending of a prophet be connected with this blessing? Amos goes into greater detail about Israel's transgressions, but the warnings to the other nations seem to be building up to addressing Israel. How do the transgressions of the neighboring peoples compare with those of Israel? Later warnings. Amos uses visually graphic language to describe the transgressions of Israel and the coming punishments. He says, "Therefore, because you trample on the poor and take from them levies of grain, you have built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not live in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, but you shall not drink their wine." Amos's language is direct and confrontational. What situation or mindset of his audience would demand such speech? The implied setting of Amos's proclamation. Amos says God will punish the altars of Bethel. Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, reports to King Jeroboam that Amos conspires against him. What does this suggest is the setting where Amos delivers his words of warning? Read Amos 5:21 through 24. What force would these have if uttered before the altar at Bethel in the presence of priests and worshipers? In 5:24, how might Amos be challenging his audience's conception of justice or righteousness? Can a misunderstanding of this basic concept lead to a false sense of security? And is this what Amos is addressing? The structure and themes of Hosea. Like Amos, the structure of Hosea is usually understood in terms of smaller units that have common themes following each other. Hosea is generally divided into three parts: those concerned with Hosea's marriage, those which develop the parallel of Israel's unfaithfulness, followed by a concluding vision of restoration. Perhaps the most striking feature in Hosea is this vision of restoration. Notice how it concludes the first section, and then the concluding vision in chapter 14, which is a section in and of itself, is a conclusion to the whole book. The structuring function of the opening metaphor. The book of Hosea begins with a metaphor. God is to Israel as Hosea the prophet is to the prostitute he took as a wife. The metaphor seems appropriate given the warning Hosea voices in 4:12 through 13. He says, "My people consult a piece of wood, and their divining rod gives them oracles. For a spirit of whoredom has led them astray, and they have played the whore, forsaking their God. They sacrifice on the tops of mountains and make offerings upon the hills, under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because their shade is good. Therefore your daughters play the whore, and your daughter-in-laws commit adultery." In the sections that follow, what specific transgressions does Hosea address that make the whoredom metaphor appropriate? Prophets as interpreters of tradition. Both Amos and Hosea confront Hebrews who appear to think they are secure in their relationship with God. Both prophets assume their audiences have some knowledge of Hebrew traditions, particularly the traditions we know from the book of Exodus about the exodus from Egypt and the wanderings of the people in the wilderness. Compare Amos 5:25 and Hosea 2:14 through 20 and 9:10. How do each of these prophets use recollections of the Hebrews in the wilderness? It would help here to read the chapter Tradition Criticism in the Hayes Holliday book, Biblical Exegesis. Hayes and Holliday discuss how one of the aims of exegesis is to understand how biblical writers draw on earlier traditions as they make a particular point to the audience.